Greeting and I would like to welcome our speakers today, Chowra Makaremi. We're very pleased to have her today. And I welcome everyone who joined us on Sunday. And uh, I would like to be brief in my introduction, but before like to let you know about our next program, which is going to be on May 15th. Elham Homifar. She's our next speaker. She's going to talk about environmental social movements in Iran, a challenge to the dominant narrative. A very, very interesting topic. And I invite everyone who's interested to join us on May 15th. Before I let our speakers talk, I would like to get permission to just have a very brief introduction about her topic, which is very, very interesting and inviting. What do social science and specifically anthropology say about mass violence? And what tools, methods, and theories does this offer to better understand the post-revolution era in Iran, especially in the 1980s? Many studies around the globe have tried to grasp the mechanism and effects of collective violence, not only as a destructive experience, but as what produces and maintains power dynamics, institutions, and social structures. They also look at how these phenomena are experienced every day. They live on people, groups, and how these individual and collective levels relate to each other. How does the narration of violence and lack thereof reshape social and political identities, our understanding of citizenship, national belonging, and public space? This anthropological knowledge, built in various geographical and historical situations, helps us better understand the history of violence in post-revolutionary Iran and its actuality. Many of you might be already familiar with Chowra's work. Just very briefly to give an overview of her work. Chowra is a writer, director, and anthropologist at National Center for Scientific Research in Paris. She has conducted fieldwork and coordinated several research collectives on border control in Europe. Since 2010, she has been working on post-revolution violence in Iran, leading the ERC research program offsite on the subject. She has published Aziz's notebook At the Heart of the Iranian Revolution in 2011, and with Hana Darabi, another book, Enqilab Street, A Revolution Through Books, 1979-1983, in 2019. She also directed the documentary movie Hitch, an Iranian story, in 2019 in France, which has won awards in documentary and ethnographic film festival in Paris, Buenos Aires, Linz, and Marseille. And for those of you, if you haven't seen the film, I highly recommend it. What a fascinating film, Chowra, and one of those rare documentaries and films about a historical event that happened in Iran. And unfortunately, we don't have many. So your work is very, very precious as far as I can tell. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our speakers. Thank you so much, Chowra, to accept our invitation, and please start the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chowra John, for your kind introduction. I'm very happy to be with you in this program. I want first to thank the organizers of the Berkeley Lecture Series and especially Fania Marsoudlou for their kind invitation. I'm honored to be here today, and I'm very glad to announce all of you that Macron is the new French president, pushing away the risk of the far right coming into power in France, which was a real risk. So it's with a lighter heart that I'm starting this talk in English, as you can hear. Although I speak and read Farsi and I lead also my field research in Farsi, I'm more comfortable to express ideas in English and to use this language to talk about subjects that are not practical or everyday matters. But English is not my first language either, since I live and work in France. So I thank you for bearing my French accent, be it in English or in Farsi. And another reason why I'm not speaking Farsi today, although it would have been really a pride and maybe an achievement to do so, is because I feel that Farsi, like the French language, are languages that have little tolerance for those who don't master them perfectly. In Farsi, like in French, there is a relationship between form and content that implicitly and almost unconsciously refuses the credit of knowledge or clear argumentation, complex argumentation, to those who don't speak perfectly. And this relationship between form and content is not so strong in English, where we have been used to pay attention to what is being said, even where there are misuses or shortages in the way it is being said, and there will be, since my English is not my native language. So we can argue that this is because the imperialism of the English language that is now being used by, for instance, a scholar born in Iran and raised in France since the age of 6, who is talking to Iranians residing in the US and maybe in other parts of the world. And it is certainly linked to this imperialism of the English language. But I think that the difficulty of the French and Farsi audiences to give intellectual credit, let's say, to imperfect speakers is also a product of the colonial history and colonial cultures of these two nations, and their relation to subaltern languages in their own spheres of political domination. And this is, like, for me, the comparison between French and Farsi was very enlightening in a perspective with English in there. So I just wanted to share these preliminary thoughts with you, since Farsi has gone through so many transformations since the Islamic Cultural Revolution, but also since the acceleration of globalization in the 1990s and the new technologies that shaped new transnational citizenships and public spheres in the last 2 decades. I grew up in exile within a community which believed, and I think very rightly so, that the mastery of a neat, beautiful Farsi was a way of resisting the ways in which the post-revolution theocratic power was attacking the language, distorting it, impoverishing it, creating a language of its own as a way to both perpetuate and cover up violence. And I had the privilege, for instance, of working with Vidas Tabrizi in editing in Farsi the memoirs of my grandfather and translating my own writings on them in the book Yaddashtha, which is the Farsi translation of Aziz's notebook. And I remember Vida's obsession as a writer in using a clear, simple structure and always privileging Farsi over Arab words. This was also an everyday resistance against the corrosive distortion of language that in theocracy and the effects of that on our subjectivities as Iranian. But I also wonder what this attachment to the perfection of language skills and accent as signs maybe of knowledge or entitlement, what this hides in terms of the reality of a multi-generational transnational public sphere, a challenge and maybe another form of resistance and political creativity through language would actually be to question ourselves on what kind of forum or what kind of collective practices could open up the floor for second generation Iranians like myself, people who came abroad as children, and imperfect Farsi speakers, to benefit from their contributions in the Farsi-speaking transnational public spheres. So this really quite long introduction now to say that, in a word, it seems that language in its relation to knowledge can be used as a tool for resistance in two ways. The first way is to enhance the knowledge of a language that is critical and aware of the impoverishments and distortions it has gone through because of a political history. But the second option would be to build knowledge through a more inclusive use of languages that can, for instance, rely on the notion of creolization or hybridization and multiple impure identities as legitimate creative cultural forms in themselves. And this is what we, as second generations, as like Iranian-European, Iranian-Americans, carry on, bear with us. And this is all the more true that these multi-layered identities and impure, so to say, cultural productions or products are not only, but notably also the product of a political history that has seen the larger waves in the history of Iranian immigration after the revolution and the beginning of the war, what we called in migration studies, the second wave of Iranian immigration from 79 to the mid 1990s. It's precisely in this, on this political history that I would like to focus my presentation now. And on this decade that runs from the revolution until the death of Khomeini and the change in the constitution in 1989. I used to call this decade, so from 1979 to the constitutional changes of 89, I used to call that the Khomeini years, but this expression usually terrifies people, like Khomeini, let's not talk about it. And actually, my project is not to make us travel back through the events and sometimes, the blurred and contested chronologies of this decade. It is more the question of how we relate to their memory and legacy, exploring that movement, maybe of taking distances when we pronounce the word like the Khomeini years. How we talk or don't talk about them, what we say and what we don't want, don't dare, sometimes don't even feel appropriate to say. At the heart of the events and of our diverse, contested memories of them are episodes of collective violence. And more precisely, but I will not get into the precise chronology of that, but the history of the consolidation of the Iranian state after the revolution is a history of violence that implies both a very deadly war and with an external enemy, Iraq, but also within the Iranian society, episodes of what we could call extreme violence. Extreme violence is a term coined by historians such as Christian Gerlach, who is the author of the highly acclaimed book Extremely Violent Societies, published in 2012 at Cambridge University Press. Also, another historian that coined this notion is Jacques Semelin, who's a French historian and sociologist, and who is the instigator of the online encyclopedia of mass violence, and also the Mass Violence and Resistance Research Network in Paris that has a monthly review. He coined the term, so Semelin coined the term extreme violence, and he defines it, he characterizes it by two main dimensions. The first one is the quantitative aspect. Extreme violence is a massive violence where thousands of people are killed in fightings, under torture, or in executions, as was the case, for instance, in the 1980s in Daeshas in Iran. The second aspect is the qualitative aspect. There is this massive violence, but also there are elements of cruelty and desubjectivation. And by desubjectivation, very roughly, we can refer to the crushing of our subjectivities and our ways of relating to ourselves and to others as humans. So if we go back to Christian Gerlach's comparative study of what he calls extremely violent societies, there are two additional things and at least maybe one I will have the time to go through. One main point that I would like to add to this definition of extreme violence being, mass violence characterized by cruelty and desubjectivation. This additional aspect is that the notion of extreme violence is coined by historians, as I said, and it enables to study events outside the frames and definitions of concepts such as genocides, war crimes, crimes against humanity, or even politicide that were set by courts and jurists or legal thinkers. So all these are legal concepts. And another important element is so this way of distanciating oneself as a researcher from these legal concepts illustrates or shows an attempt to grasp social facts and events without using legal grammar and argumentation. And I think this is one of the main, incentives in exploring these notions such as extreme violence and what they can, how we can use them in the case of Iran. This attempt to grasp social facts and to grasp events without using legal thinking is important, and why it is important. First, because situations in real life and history are always much messier and more complex than the criteria that are set by legal thinking for characterizing such situations as genocide, or crime against humanity, for instance. The important point here is that the legal thinking is not describing reality. It's not giving us concepts or tools to describe an event or to understand a social phenomenon. It is building, so legal concepts are building an abstract and logical system of thinking that allows the jurists to reach a decision or to apply a rule. So the aim is not a better understanding of the world. It is the application of one rule or the production of a judgment. And the way to reach this is to schematize and focus on certain aspects of events in order to build a legal argumentation that is oriented towards a specific aim, such as obtaining a court decision or arguing that one specific rule is the one that should apply in this situation, and so forth. So to sum up here, the notion of extreme violence comes from a need to emancipate, I dare say, social science and the construction of knowledge on what actually happened to, the construction of knowledge on what happened to whom, in which ways, etc., to emancipate this knowledge from the frames of legal thinking and concepts. And I think that those frames are extremely heavy and hegemonic in our world. So to take a distance, to distanciate ourselves from those frames in order to assess situations in their complexities. So we are not looking for legal responsibility, but we are exploring the unfolding of events that happen through many choices, often paradoxical choices, and also the intertwining of collective and individual stakes. For instance, Christian Gerlach is not advocating that some societies are extremely violent in his book called Extremely Violent Societies. But on the very contrary, he uses the notion of extreme violence, so that a non-juridic, a non-legal notion, an open notion, to look into these situations where, for instance, a genocide was carried out, but the perpetrators were not only state actors, but also a portion of the civil population was killing for economic opportunity and social upward mobility, while the police and military actors were carrying a genocidal plan of, eradication of a group. So some case studies he refers to, Gerlach refers to, are the genocide of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, for instance, or the killing of the Indonesian communists, but also the members of the Chinese community at large in Indonesia in 65 and 66. To come back to the Iranian Reshapes, in the light of these elements, we can say that the qualitative and quantitative aspects are present in the collective violence that accompanied the decade of consolidation of the Islamic Republic. But the history of this extreme violence in its details and social complexities has not been the subject of a constituted field of knowledge yet, as were many other places and times, such as maybe, just to quote some case studies that were the basis of very solid social science studies in social science, Haiti and Algeria in colonial France, Greece under the dictators, Guatemala and Peru during the genocide and civil wars, Mexico after the revolution, the civil conflict in Colombia, the occupation of Palestine, Chile and Argentina during the dictatorships. These are a few places that were covered by solid scholarship on this issue of collective violence, the memory or absence of memory of violence, and the way this has shaped the relationships between state and society, and the notion of citizenship or political participation, if you don't want, if you don't consider that these subjects are citizens. So the way this relation between state and society has shaped the notion of political participation in these places. And there are also places contexts that are confronted with the same kind of difficulties that we are facing in Iran, such as, for instance, Franco-Spain, the civil war in Spain. We tend, like sometimes I hear that, the Spanish history of memory of violence and reconciliation is kind of exemplar because it's a Western or European state, but it's not the case at all. Actually, Spain is very, very behind all those many other places and many other works on violence and social memories of violence, because there has been a law of amnestia, a law that forbids the research on the history of violence. So in Iran, we can identify maybe two major moments in relation to these memory of violence or narratives, study of extreme violence in the Reshapes. And I will argue that now is the moment to shift towards maybe a third moment. So the two major moments maybe that we had until now was first a period that opened in the very early 1990s and that is still going on today, and that is efforts in individual narratives and testimonies of violence. So memoirs have been written. There is a whole very, very comprehensive, very vibrant literature of prison memoirs and prison literature, and even those memoirs and narratives have been studied themselves. So there are studies on prison literature in the Reshapes, and so there is an enormous set of testimonies that are individual testimonies based on personal memories of former prisoners mainly, and one of, I think, their main it's not the case for all of them, but almost really all of them. One of their main characteristic is that these testimonies have been written outside of Iran in exile and published in exile, and now they're traveling back and at some level, at some scale. These are not bestsellers. And we have very few narratives and testimonies written on the spot, in the time and place of violence. And it's very important because, of course, the context reshapes memory, reframes memory. Our memory is always being reconfigured by the context in which we're talking. And just before, for instance, giving this talk, we were talking with the organizers about how, if Marine Le Pen would have been elected president, that was a real risk today. How this would have changed maybe the whole texture and meaning of also these talks in some way. So the context, changed the narrative and the memory. The second moment is that has been kind of initiated in the 2010, in the years 2010 up until now, so it's a long decade, is the moment where these narratives become, and these testimonies become evidence. And they play a leading role in an attempt of legal characterization, of legal definition of violence. So there have been the reports of Bonio de Borouman, for instance, or the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center in 2010. Both those reports were published in 2010. There has been the Iran Tribunal Initiative in 2012, up until Amnesty International's report for the 30 years of the 1988 massacre, which was a massive work in collecting evidence. So all these efforts have transformed, so the narratives have been transformed into evidence on which legal argumentation could be built. And this legal argumentation has reached a consensus around the notion of crimes against humanity. So against humanity. So basically, the focus was put mainly on the 1988 massacres, although works like that of Nasser Mohajer have shown that there have been other prison massacres before 1988. But there has been a focus on one event, the 1988 massacre, and on one legal definition, argumentation that was that of crime against humanity. And this consensus that has been shaped throughout the long decade is challenged today very seriously by the trial of Hamid Nouri, who is sued for war crimes and aggravated murder. Although these charge of war crimes is due to legal opportunity and not to a different outlook on the events. Originally, the charges that were published by the prosecutors in August 2021, a few days before the trial started, these charges stated very precisely that the events, the crimes for which Hamid Nouri is tried could be called crimes against humanity in another setting. But since the Swedish law is not competent, cannot review, cannot judge crime against humanity that happened before 2014, that is the date where the law on crime against humanity has been passed in Sweden. Because of this legal problem, let's say, by opportunity, Hamid Nouri's charges have been requalified as war crimes. So throughout, the decade from 2010 until the judgment that will come, the judgment of Hamid Nouri, that we are awaiting for in late May 2022, in next month. The history of violence was written through the law, through legal actions, through reports, and through legal argumentation and grammar. And this is very important because we haven't had a historiography on the events. And this is really jurists came on a kind of a virgin land, and they built legal argumentations that solidified into narrative, into historical narrative. So and why this is not sufficient to my point of view, and you know, from a social science, let's say anthropological perspective, is because in this process facts become evidence to gather, to build one's argumentation, to fit one's definition, to make one point. So everything that is not relevant to that specific argumentation doesn't fit in the 1,000 pages of legal reports that have been written so far. So there are many aspects and dimensions of the experience of this extreme violence that just don't fit the purpose, don't fit the argumentation, don't fit the frame that has been set for writing the history of this decade. And I think it's a shame because this is not helping us grasp, you know, what happened and the reality and the complexity of what happened. And what is at stake now is building a knowledge of the past that is exactly going back to all that doesn't fit legal narratives and definitions, but that is important nonetheless to understand several dimensions on which the anthropology of violence is focused, and that allow us to understand past violence in relation to the present, to understand and also why this silence took shape and why the topic is still sensitive after all these decades, and also what are the uses of this past, the different uses of this past today. So maybe now I will end my try to wrap up my talk in you know, going through some of these dimensions that an anthropological perspective or anthropological studies of violence can help us pay attention to in the narratives of extreme violence in Iran. So the first one, the most, you know, my main argument, maybe the most obvious one, it's not my main argument, but it is I think it's an important point, is what Chowra John was saying in the introduction, which is understanding violence not only as something that blindly destroys people, movements, social, political movements, places, family, social or political relations and networks, etc. So violence is not only that, a blind destruction. It's also what produces new state apparatuses, new social relations, new, you know, kinds of social mobilities maybe, or opportunities, new institutional cultures that are both created and maintained through violence. And very quickly, maybe we can think of two examples that show that in the case of Iran. The first one is the portrait of a perpetrator that we can draw through the trajectory of Hamid Nouri, as he himself recalls his social and political trajectory in his interrogations at the court. So he recalls, he tells the social trajectory of, like, almost iconic trajectory of, you know, someone who was a teenager when the revolution, who was finishing high school when the revolution happened, and then who get enrolled in very revolutionary, devoted Islamist emotion, you know, ideology and revolutionary emotions, and he became a soldier in the Sepah. A very zealous one, because he participated he took part in the war of Sanandaj in Kurdistan, which was a very a bloody, violent episode of military repression and you know, warlike violence. Then he enrolled So he was trained that there in Sanandaj. Then he enrolled in the Revolutionary Court, and he started his career in the Iranian prison, in the Tehran prison as a guard. But then he and little by little, because he was a zealous guard, because he was a good entrepreneur of violence, he entered bureaucracy, and he started this upward mobility that led him, after Daesh in the era of reconstruction, to create a company working in construction and to enter business through his networks in SEPA and Revolutionary Court. So he's transforming his career in violence, in state violence, into economic opportunity, being an actor, a street level, as we say in sociology, a street level actor of this post-1990s Iranian neoliberalism, and illustrating by his trajectory the share and the rule of also actors of the state security apparatus in these booming economic sectors. So in this way, and another like even quicker maybe example of how violence is productive of apparatuses and relations, etc., is how the Kurdish military intervention, this war of Sanandaj I was talking about, has been a laboratory of government, where the practice, the warfare, and the police knowledge of the SEPA took shape and solidified. And really, we have a corps here that has been also, that took shape, and that was structured and acquired cultural, institutional culture and warfare knowledge, etc., through one specific episode of violence that has been understudied, and that is the 1979, the war that started in Kurdistan in 1979. Another dimension maybe of a way to look at extreme violence through the lens of anthropology is, ethnographic studies, empirical studies, and the attention to social relations, to emotions, to the articulation between the individual and the collective, enable us to better assess the effects of violence on the social body, and how, for instance, silence is not a personal choice, but a social phenomena that is shaped and created by specific practices. And these practices are the practices of power, are the mechanisms of violence themselves. To illustrate that, we can think about the destruction of mass graves, or graves of executed political prisoners in the Daesh, the destruction that took place in the last years of this forensic evidence, but also the fact that when those executions and massacres happened at that time, bodies were not always given back to the family, so that the people did not always have, the people who were killed did not always have proper burial. And the effect of these disappearances on the social body is very, very important, and has been studied by sociologists and anthropologists who work on disappearance in Argentina, for instance, or in Guatemala. The anthropologist Victoria Sanford wrote a book called Buried Secrets, and she wrote an extensive ethnographic study of the effect, the impact of the lack of proper burial, based on the reports of the Commission on Truth and Reconciliation in Guatemala. So we can see also how anthropologists and social scientists can claim back those legal reports and use this material as archival sources by paying attention maybe details that do not find a place into legal argumentation, but nonetheless are given by witnesses. As for me, for instance, and maybe I'll conclude after that. For me, what the ways in which anthropological perspective helped me understand the relationship between violence, silence, and memory was and the impact, the social effect of interdiction of burial was the study by an anthropologist that dates back to the early 20th century, in the 1920s. So Robert Hines was an anthropologist who was doing, like Marcel Mauss, they were doing these very exhaustive comparative studies where they were not gathering primary data, ethnographic, empirical data themselves by going on the field as we do now in ethnography, but they were reading many different reports, ethnographic reports in very different contexts, and they were trying to sketch, some trends that were that existed in very different cultural contexts and social settings. And so Robert Hines worked on the fact that human beings, as much as they stand on 2 feet, they're bipeds, they're also burying their dead. So that's something that we do, that we've always done, and that's also something that makes us human anthropologically. So he studied the different ways in which dead are buried in or buried or cremated or whatever, mummified in different cultures. And what he take out of it is this idea that the process of mourning to mourn one's dead is a double movement, both of separation and synthesis. You separate yourself from that specific individual that now is dead, and you separate them from the social body, so they're no longer there, and you accept that. And at the same time, that's the synthesis, you reaffirm collectively that the social body is stronger than destruction, it's stronger than death. So social life overcomes death. And this is the ritual function and the social function, the anthropological function of burial. And since we are symbolic beings, we're humans, this has a very important function. It's very primordial. It's like breathing, it's like eating, it's like, so we have to for a society to function properly, for a community or a group to have the impression that their social organization is stronger than death, overcomes death, we have to bury our death properly. So now we understand, the impact and the targeting and the specific function also of not giving back the bodies of those who are executed or desecrating their graves. And here we also understand that we can think about disappearance, as a form of political violence, not only within the very specific legal definition. A disappear is someone, someone took, like a state agent took them, and then we don't know what become of them. This is the legal definition, but there is also anthropological and social experience of disappearance, which is this absence of burial. So the specificity of anthropological approach to the study of violence is, in these elements I've tried to very quickly unravel, but it's also, and I would conclude on that, in the attention to affects and to emotions, in the sense that, and this is where anthropology is different from sociology, for instance, or political science, it's on how we treat facts and how we treat narratives. We're not in an investigative episteme. We're not collecting evidences to establish a truth, like, you know, a police officer will do, or a lawyer will do, or a sociologist or a criminologist will do in some case. We are not in a positivist approach to knowledge production, which is based on neutrality and objectivity, but it's, you know, it's reversing these kind of episteme, this scientific methodology into ethnography is reversing that into a subjective and an intersubjective methodology, where so we are very, you know, we don't have to claim our neutrality, but even more, we locate ourselves into our studies or in the production of knowledge. And this is true in two ways. The first way is that is the attention to how individual emotions become shared and reframe political spaces and political participation in some way. So we really pay attention to the also to the social, political, and collective dimension of emotions and passions. And, you know, as extreme violence and as revolution show, emotions play a huge role. And in this sense, we can refer to the, for instance, the study of, it was a seminal study. This is why I'm quoting it, because and I think it will resonate with many people who are you know, who have a connection with the story, with the history of the Reshapes. Is a study in antique Greece. So it's an Hellenist, a historian, Nicole Leroux, a woman, a French historian, who wrote a wonderful study called Mothers in Mourning, where she studied this for interdiction that was made by the city of Athens in the antiquity, the interdiction that was made to the mothers of soldiers to mourn their dead sons when, you know, the armies were coming back from war with the Persians, and they learned about the death of their sons at war. And this interdiction of mourning the death of a relative was based in the clear conscience, the clear knowledge that Athens politicians and Athens elite had of the power of emotions and affects, family relations. And this is a very powerful political matrix. And Nicole Leroux in her study is showing that, and her study has been very useful for anthropologists who have worked on Argentina and the movements of the mothers of Plaza de Mayo. So how you have political movements that are political forms of political participations or challenges that are rooted into individual emotions reshaped at a collective level. And I think that in Iran, this study would be even more interesting in the sense that this came for political prisoners, this interdiction of mourning came within a larger frame where the political force of emotions was totally understood by the authorities and used by the authorities, but in a reverse sense, which was not forbidding mourning, but overstaging and totally controlling it within the Shia, you know, creation of martyrdom at war with Iran. But beyond that, and this is the kind of the last stage on which I would conclude this presentation. Not only emotions are important to take into account, to pay attention to, you know, in order to understand situations and histories, but there is also and also power relations, but there is also a heuristic value of emotions, a heuristic value in the sense that I feel my French accent is awful here, it's not helping, in the sense that the emotions have a value, are helping us to construct knowledge, to build knowledge. They're producing knowledge. It's not only that we have to take them, it's not that we have to erase them to be neutral observers, objective observers. It's not that we have to study them, look at them, but with, maybe a detached eye of a researcher, and to look at their mechanisms. But our own emotions as researchers are helping us understand things. So we're understanding through our emotions. And this kind of epistemic shift was advocated for very convincingly by the Mexican-American anthropologist Renato Rosaldo, who did a study of Headhunters tribes, the Hilongo tribe in Philippines. So headhunting is a practice by which it's a form of mourning, by which when a relative is deceased, then you go the ritual, the funerary ritual, the ritual of mourning, like their chelom. Their chelom is to go and to hand the head of someone, to cut a head and then to mummify it, to cut a human head and then to mummify it. And Renato Rosaldo was doing a whole study of headhunters and why, this was their funerary ritual, what was the function, with his wife, Michelle Rosaldo. And at the end of their ethnographic fieldwork, she died. She fell from a bridge and she died. And he felt, and Renato Rosaldo felt a huge anger. And by feeling that huge anger, he was angry at his wife. Why was she so stupid? Why she could, did she put her foot in that place and fell? And this anger that he felt help him understand the headhunters ritual through the lens of, and the function of controlling anger. And he rewrote his study. And as an introduction in his first chapter, he told this story and how his own emotions have brought him a mix of insight and blindness. But there was insight in there, so he opened his eyes on some elements. So the importance of being very located in the knowledge that we produce, not something that we should control only, but also as something that we should use in order to build knowledge. I will stop here because I've been too long and I want to leave time for the discussions. But thank you very much for having been here with me, and I hope I have been clear, and I'm very happy to be clearer in my response.
Thank you very much for such a I was going to say provocative, thought provocative, but it's also motion provocative talk. You touch on the issues that we don't hear it very often. The topic of your talk is very important, yet it's very difficult. It's very difficult to talk about. And watching the documentary you created and a couple of interviews, I know that this topic is also very close to heart for you. It's very personal. And I would like to start with the last part, since I believe we have one question. And let me start with that question, then I come back to my question, because I watched your film, Hitch, recently, and I'm very impressed by that, very relevant to your talk. But anonymous attendee asked you this question, Chowra. Hamid Nouri's trial in Sweden is a good example of extreme violence and crime against humanity. Why it is limited to him and not extended to the government of Iran? What do you think it needs to be done to expand and cover others in the government of Iran? Will it help our community in Iran in their anger? Will it help our community in their anger and mourning? So that's the question. And anonymous listener ask you.
So this brings us back to legal discussions, actually, because these are legal reasons. I think there are legal reasons why the trial is that of Hamid Nouri and not that of other perpetrators or other authorities. For instance, Ebrahim Raisi, who was in charge during the 88 massacre, who is now president. So it's because a court, if the court is not a special court set up by the UN, then it's a court, it's a national court, it's not an international court. And Iran, since those crimes have been committed before the 1991 Rome Treaty and the creation of the International Penal Court, then there is no international forum yet. One day there can be a UN tribunal if they want to, but for now there is no international forum. And national courts have the possibility to judge a crime against humanity, a genocide, a war crime that has been committed outside of their time and space, their country, and does not involve them as a nation personally. They have the competence to judge that upon a rule that is called universal jurisdiction. So that for instance, when Ronald Rumsfeld was traveling to Germany, German lawyers sued him for war crimes in Iraq, but Germany didn't have anything to do with that. But they can sue an American perpetrator for crimes in Iraq under jurisdiction, universal jurisdiction. And this is what has been applied to Hamid Nouri in Sweden. But since Sweden only integrated crime against humanity in 2000, so the Rome Treaty only in 2014, now the charges are war crime. And Hamid Nouri is the only person who could be arrested by Swedish police after a warrant has been, issued by a prosecutor, because there were evidence. There were evidence of his. There were suspicion, evidence. There was enough evidence to charge him, to make him to put him in preventive detention and to start a trial against him. And this is very individual. So this is individual-based justice, like Eichmann in Jerusalem. It was the whole Nazi system which was tried in Jerusalem, but it was the specific person of Eichmann who was tried because he was the one the Nazi hunters could hunt, and another way of being headhunters. And I mean, we are confronted with, to those mechanism architectures of global justice and impunity, etc. And this is the thing. So I think we should free ourselves from this belief that it's the law that can solve our problems. It's not. I think that, like, as long as I am concerned, I think it's not a trial of one person like Hamid Nouri, or even of several persons in an international trial. It's not a trial that can help a society solve their relationship to the past and to memory, and to the memory of a violence. So that it's another. I think there are other routes. There are other ways, and this is why we. And since the route of justice, of international justice, is closed for us now, then it's even wiser to go and follow these other paths that open. And maybe just as an example, there was this movie, to go back to the movies, there were and to the role of cinema, for instance, in that, like why hasn't there been many movies, novels, etc., written on that history? And there was a movie called The Act of Killing that was investigating the denial of the 65 and 66 Indonesian genocide, the genocide of Indonesian communists and Chinese Indonesians. So the movie was investigating the denial of that massacre, because the movie makers went and started to make a movie on the massacres, and then they find out that the victims didn't want to talk, but the perpetrators were very proud of their deeds. So then they shoot a movie on the perpetrators' narration and pride and their imaginaries of violence. And this movie was, and it's an Oscar-winning movie, The Act of Killing. Wonderful movie, because at the end you can see the body of the perpetrator that is telling a truth that he is denying throughout the. I'm telling you the end, which is very bad. But please watch it. And this movie has opened up a huge forum for discussions within Indonesia, and there has been, like dozens of hundreds of movies, theaters that played the movie, and then there were debates, and the youth, the Indonesian youth, went there and saw the movies and talked about it. Whereas, while there was an official Truth and Justice Commission that was issued after Suharto's death, and it never opened up the collective social memory and the history of violence the way that movie did. So in Indonesia, we have a case where the legal path, or legal concept or procedures, reports were not enough and were not convincing, did not carry society with them, while narratives could do that, open up.
Very good, very interesting. There's another question by Mehran. He would like to ask you directly. So please go ahead, Mehran.
Thank you. You have my voice?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Makaremi, for the great insight to extreme violence and how to deal with it. First of all, it was very interesting for me to hear you in terms of how the mourning or the victims, how they approach in terms of, or the bigger society, try to understand the violence that has happened to them, and the legal system who's trying to fit it into certain legal terms or legal action. So that was very interesting. And as you mentioned, it doesn't really fit in there. The society needs to understand it in a different way in order to mourn or bring about all that has happened to them. So my question, you kind of answered it in one sense through the Indonesian experience. In Argentina, South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation, and many other examples, those happens after those regimes have gone. So my question is, while that regime is perpetrating these, is not gone, and it's hard to do it in that country, if you can give us examples of how do societies deal with this besides the legal part outside of the country. The movie example in Indonesia was very interesting, but are there other ways for us Iranian community in general to deal with this? Is it movies, or what other examples are there? Because writing narratives, writing books has happened. It does help, but it's still limited in a sense, that the big pain is still there. People have, even the victims or the people who have lost their loved ones in like Nouri's trial or other trials, even they cannot say everything. They cannot really open up because they're limited, as you mentioned. So where do they do that? And how does the society do it while the regime is still in place? I mean, if there are examples in research and studies, I would like to hear it.
Yes, actually, that was the main topic of a conference, an international conference we organized with Shekufe Sahi and Paris Shafafi in 2014 that was truth-seeking and truth-telling in context of in states of impunity, in context where there has not been a transition. And what we were doing was to adopt a critical kind of perspective on the fact that transitional justice models are applied in even in cases where there is no transition at site. So how do you reconcile? How do you apply a transitional justice model when there is no transition? And of course, like for the example of Guatemala, or we can think also about the work of Kimberly Thieden, medical anthropologist in whose work with a gender perspective on the civil war in Peru. And most of her research is also based on the Truth and Reconciliation kind of program that took place in post-civil war Peru. So all those are studies that are rendered possible, that are possible because they're using sources, they're using as sources, as archive, material that come out of the transitional justice process. How do we do that in social science and, you know, as legal activists when there is no transition? What we really focused on was the people's tribunals. People's tribunals are more and more active and spread up in the world, and even they are becoming even like they have a paradoxical even trend, because they have become, for instance, in Germany, there has been this NSU killing. The NSU killings in Germany was neo-Nazi crimes, neo-Nazi murders of Turkish immigrants. So a dozen Turkish immigrants have been killed, like it was a chain killing by a neo-Nazi group. And the police believed it was like mafia, you know, crimes of, because all those Turkish immigrants were owners of small shops, or, you know, middle class migrants who were where they shouldn't be, right? In social mobility upward. So the people who had been murdered, the police was very harsh with the families, because the German police believed that there were mafia crimes and there was like an omerta, and that's why they couldn't solve the crime. And eventually that neo-Nazi group claimed the crimes themselves, since the police was so slow in finding them, and they say we did it. And then what we find out what was found out in Germany is that there was 250 connections between the police, German police, and those neo-Nazis from this. And so the scandal becomes the relationship between secret services, German police, and neo-Nazi groups. I'm telling all this to say that there has been there has been a parliamentary commission of 3,000 page report of 3,000 pages on these NSU killings. There has been a trial in Germany, like really a rule of law trial, very heavy trial of the one remaining member of this neo-Nazi group for these 11 killings. And yet, along this trial that was taking place in Frankfurt, we cannot say that they didn't have access to the law in Germany or didn't have access to court, but along that there was a people's tribunal, because the families of the victims were unsatisfied with the way their history of violence has been treated by the media and by the state. And it's very telling for me, because people's tribunal have become both a replacement for a missing forum of justice, where international tribunals don't, you know, international court, UN court don't exist, or when there is no universal jurisdiction being applied to one single perpetrator. So there is a people's tribunal takes the place of, but it's also a way of denouncing the functioning of justice, the justice system. So really it does both at the same time. And we, if you're interested in this, we published a special issue of the Political and Legal Anthropological Review. That is the review of the that is you know, a review in legal anthropology, a journal in legal anthropology, and we did a special issue with Pardis Shafafi following the conference on people's tribunals and on impunity. So we explored through different cases how what kind of legal activism was used in those cases where justice could not be rendered. And one of our main question was, you know, can we use the grammar of the law? Can we, is our people's tribunal, can they be a counter-hegemonic enterprise in the way that Gramsci is defined hegemony? So are we having a counter-hegemonic enterprise or not? Or is there something that is, we're always trapped in the mechanisms of laws? And as long as a society in a whole, as a whole is concerned, I think that we should be clear about the role or the function that, you know, do we want to be consoled? Do we want to feel better? Maybe the feminists will never feel better. Maybe there is no consolation. Maybe there is no possible, you know, peace that could be found. Maybe it's something that will remain open, and only time can maybe appease it a bit. But this is what I explore in the movie Hitch. Like, is it wise? Is it even feasible? Is it rational to want to close that open wound? But the other thing is, you know, why are we doing it? Are we doing it to console ourselves, to find peace, to find appeasement, or are we doing it because these past crimes have present effects? And this is the actualization of violence today that keeps perpetuating the regime that is in power, the power that is in place. And this is my belief. Like we are, and I studied that, and I'm writing on that through the notion of khat qermez, red line. How, you know, extreme violence in the 1980s in Daesh has not only it's a red line to talk about it, but extreme violence has instituted the red line as a mechanism, as a relation between state and society. Khat qermez is a way, you know, is a relation between state and society that is very important to understand political participation in Iran, and that has been instituted through the experience of extreme violence. So understanding extreme violence and understanding Daesh is also important in order to understand the rules of political participation in today's Iran, I think, through, you know, that khat qermez. I mean, today's Iran. In Iran, let's say until last June. Today's Iran, I don't know anymore.
Thank you. Thank you very much for, you know, the detailed answers. I would like to remind our audience that please, if you have any question, you may write it on our chat board, both in English and Farsi, whichever is more convenient for you. Since we don't have a question yet, I ask permission to ask my question. I have a couple of questions, but I try to combine it. In one of your interviews, you mentioned something about public secret. So I'd like to, if you may, address that issue, the collective consciousness, if I may use that term, how our society deals with that secret collectively. We have a tendency in the last 40 years or so, if we address this violence, extreme violence, from the governmental point of view, the oppressive forces and political power. As an anthropologist, I'm sure you study also the perspective of people. So that's one question. If you can have that as a background, let me also ask you my second question, and in whatever forms you would like, you can combine your answer. As I mentioned earlier, that I watched the Hitch, your documentary recently, and I noticed something. First of all, I want to congratulate you. You were, as a filmmaker, the parts that you were present in the film, you came across as very honest, as you know, showing your emotions, connecting with people you interview. Mostly they were your family members. So you took your audience within your family circles, and feels very comfortable. They feel very comfortable in front of camera. But what touched me the most was your grandma. When you had your camera on her, and back to the importance of emotions. So your comments about how emotions are important, how we can help, how our emotions can help us produce knowledge as well as understand our experiences. So that gave me like automatically a flashback with your grandma's reaction when you had your camera on her, and she was we say sabzi khordan pak mikard. She was you know, like washing herbs, and she showed some kind of mixture of emotions. On one hand, you were granddaughter asking very, very personal and secretive questions, and she trusted you, and so she opened up and she shared some of her experiences from those 60s, those years, 1980s massacres, and her personal experience losing two of her daughters, right? But very quickly, after she expressed a little bit of her sadness, her disappointed, her very quickly, she moved away from camera and started doubting that whether or not it was okay that she shared that. So I noticed that mixture of trust and distrust in her reaction. And I totally could relate to her because as someone, you know, experienced those years also in Iran, I was there, it was very fearful. You know, it was for everybody, especially for families. Not only they were in fear of their own lives, but they were afraid of losing someone else's, another family member. And so they were super cautious. So those mixture of emotions were very familiar to me, but seeing her on camera demonstrating those emotions was really touching. So I don't know if you were aware or if you just created that, or what do you think about that scene or your own experience as a filmmaker, getting close to such a taboo topic, such a secret in your family secret, which at the same time had that social aspect. It was a collective secret that, as you probably you know better than I do, for years, I can say at least 2 decades, people wouldn't talk about it. People wouldn't mention Dahe 60 or Koshtara Dahe 60, 1980 80s massacres. So as an anthropologist and as a filmmaker, I was very close to this story personally. How did you experience that emotions? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harijan, and thank you for giving me the opportunity first to come back to that notion of public secret that is so important, and I think very relevant for understanding what is happening in relation to collective memory and the history of violence in Iran, because so the notion was the term was coined by the anthropologist Michael Taussig, who's an Australian anthropologist doing extensive fieldwork for years in Colombia, working on collective violence in Colombia. So both FARC violence and counterinsurgency and anti-drug policies and the different ways this violence also is used in and has been institutionalized in, for instance, the economic functioning of the society. But in any case, it's he came up with this idea of the public secret as something that is both secret and known. It's not. It's something that everyone knows that they shouldn't know. And he said, okay, we have, as a society, we have a social knowledge of what we should know and what we should not know. And there are things that we know we shouldn't know. And so it's a public secret in this sense. It's not, sometimes we really don't know what is behind this public secret. And sometimes we know what is behind it. But the public secret is more about the shared knowledge, the shared social knowledge of the boundaries. And this is, this somehow in a very in a specific way, it doesn't cover it, but it goes back also to the notion of this idea of shared social boundaries and shared social knowledge, implicit knowledge. So public secret is something very important to understand politics of denial, because denial for the in the years 2010, so two decades ago, when I was talking with friends coming from Iran who studied in Iran and came as maybe to do their PhD abroad, and I was telling about the 88 massacres. They thought these were rumors. They thought these were lies or counter-revolutionary rumors. And but now maybe within these group of society, the people who are doing PhDs or pursuing studies, this history is much better known and than it was before. So there has been a trajectory of a covered knowledge that has traveled in society, although it still is not allowed. But what I want to say is that because now there is discovered knowledge, when I say there is denial of state violence in the 1980s, those interlocutors that told me, there were rumors, say, no, everyone knows about them now. It's not denied, it's not denial. People know about them. So the thing is that denial is not knowing about. And there are like many stages of denial. So denial can be about saying that the victims were the perpetrators and the perpetrators were the victims. Denial is about blaming the victims, like in the 66 massacre of the Indonesian killings of communists. The main argument that has been used since then is if communists would come to power, they would do in Indonesia what the Red Khmer had done in Cambodia. So it's good that there has been this defensive kind of movement that killed them all. So this is the blaming the victim. There is also the reverting victims and perpetrators. There is this saying, it was not 1,000 people, it was 10 people. These were not political prisoners, these were war prisoners. All those are denials. Denial is not only, knowing, not knowing. So maybe public secret is important in the sense that it helps us, be wary of the idea of, public knowledge, cover knowledge, shared social knowledge of what is being known and not known, but also because it helps us get into the specifics of a politics of denial that is not limited to knowing versus not knowing, or having facts versus not having them. Justification is also part of politics of denial. So this was for the importance of public secret in relation to denial, because my movie Hitch is about denial. And this interview with my grandmother was very, very important in many ways. I shooted it in 2007, so it's almost 15 years ago now. And this was one of the first acts that I did, in order to get closer to that past. And now in 2019 or 18, when I edited the movie that came after a long trajectory of studying and reading and writing, then I used those first footages that were really my first relationship with my first touch on the subject. And so this interview has been edited, of course. And what is the way I constructed the movie is the following. I wanted to study the impact of denial, what it does to, you know, to live in a reality that is not shared by the others. So the dissonance, the idea of dissonance, and how to get rid of the grip of denial, how to free oneself from that kind of dissociated reality. Because basically, you know, for all the Iranians whose relatives have been killed in the Reshapes and who still live in Iran, they live in a society where simply the people they know existed don't exist. So this is a huge dissonance. This is a huge social suffering that can drive you crazy, literally. But the thing is that for doing that, the methodology I followed is that, and I found it through shooting, is to depart from the idea of a trace. What is a trace? And this is why it's so important in the movie. I start with this idea of the archaeologist, and then there is the trace on the matchbox with my father. So these are all, and this came from my observation of the matchbox, because I started when I wanted to find the movie, I wanted to know how I will, you know, construct it. I went into a place with all the objects, the remains, the reminders and the remains of my mother who has been executed in 1988. And I started observing them and trying to understand what they could tell me. And so I found that trace on the matchbox. And that trace was also a gesture. Someone made that gesture. And behind that gesture, you had one person and you had the presence. So the idea was to go from trace to trace, to understand, to tell the story of a denial, of a violence that has been denied, by going from traces to traces. And those traces are what? They are resistance to silence. There are all the little traces there are all the signals, the signs of something that is resisting the silence, that is breaking the silence at a tiny level or at a big level. At a bigger level. And my grandmother's, the interview with my grandmother was the trace number, I don't know, 2 or 3, which was the fear. So the name, her trace name in my mind, as for constructing the movie, was the fear. Because as you say, what we see in her interview is that she's starting to tell, and then she stops telling, and you see the work of fear, and then she say, what you're recording is very dangerous. And then I shut off my camera. What I'm not showing in the movie, because it's edited and because it was too long and I didn't manage to convey the feeling to the audience, to the spectator, so I just didn't show it in the movie, is that in the real scene, in the shooting, I shut off my camera, because she say what you're doing is too dangerous, and she starts saying how they will arrest her, etc. So she's reviving, you know, all the fear of and the arrest, etc., and the intimidations. And then I start the camera again in the middle of a sentence, because she's starting to talk again, and she's saying it all, and she's talking about the massacres, she's talking about when my mother was transferred to Evin, and when she was disappeared, and then she come back, and then eventually 1988 happened, and then how they told the families, and how she went on the grave, and then learned that this was not her daughter's grave but someone else's grave, and she told everything. So basically, fear was the trajectory of her memory. Memory has had to go through fear to, you know, open up and tell the story, but eventually it opened up. But this you don't know in the movie, because then my grandfather's memoirs, my grandfather's testimony is telling about the 1988 massacre. But this was, so the shooting and the moment of shooting as an intersubjective construction of a narrative through fear, and also the moment of looking at the rushes, at what I shot, and understanding things through that was really a research tool. So this is why, you know, this movie is not a kind of a restitution of a research practice through a movie that will you know, talk about the themes that I'm researching in my anthropological work, but it was a research tool in itself. Making the movie was doing research with a camera in hand, and it was doing field work in a way. It helped me understand things. And another thing that is not in the movie, but that was very seminal for me, is that, so I did this shooting before. I did this shooting in 2007, this interview with my grandmother. She's not alive anymore. Otherwise, I would not have put her in the movie, so obviously. But at the time, so I interviewed her. I was not studying anthropology in the way I'm doing it now. So I was doing more, you know, a social science that were closer to critical studies and sociology. And then when she talks about my when the families heard about the news of the execution of their children, her voice is changing very much, and it's becoming heavy and a stone. And there is this stone texture to it. There is this very heavy texture to her voice. And some years after that, I read an anthropological studies that called Life and Words, Violence and a Descent into the Ordinary. Life and Words by Vidas, the Indian anthropologist Vidas, that is teaching at Johns Hopkins. And she's a very, very renowned and a wonderful anthropologist. What she did is she did a study of the ways in which the body of the woman who had gone under gender violence during the partition between India and Pakistan, how the body of these women remember what they cannot say. So she's working with Wittgenstein's theory of language and transmission, and something that is beyond or beneath language and transmission. And the example that she was making in her ethnography was that the voice of these women were becoming stone. And then I understood, I told myself that if an anthropologist, if an ethnographer can reach that level of reality, then this is what I want to do. This is, you know, this is a good, these people have good tools to understand the world, because they can make something out of this phenomenon that I experienced as a relative, and that was so important emotionally, and also for me to understand what was, you know, going on.
Thank you very much. Yeah, very, very touching. That reminded me of the scene that she talks about searching her daughter's grave in Bandar Abbas, that now they paved over it. And I believe Shradisad is helping you to locate it through Google Maps. And you have your grandma's voice when she realized that the grave has been paved. And that also, I found it very touching. You talk about legal thinking is important, right? That's a point you made in your talk, but it's not enough. It doesn't describe the complexity of that experience. And I thought art, filmmaking, of course, storytelling can do that. And your documentary, I think in many ways, touches that. It shows that complexity. So I remember your grandma's voice over that scene that you show how now those old pictures of those graves, mass graves, cement, broken, dirt, and now it's like a modern, newly built highway over it. and your grandma says something like this, that I have nothing. Now there is nothing. And I thought that was very touching.
And it's what gives the title of the movie, actually, Hitch.
Oh, that's interesting. Because throughout the film, you talk about that wardrobe, or you can commode.
Also.
That collects all these things left from your aunt and your mom, and your dad is collecting it, and he called it hitch. But yeah, it actually collect. So I think filmmakers like yourself, writers, artists, can also help us to get a better picture, more complicated picture of those experiences. But definitely your film is one of those. Let me see if there is any other question. Again, I don't see any, but if I encourage our audience patiently listening to us, but if they have, please participate. Please let us know if you have any question. Meanwhile, I have many questions, but if I may say so, maybe my last question. Would you mentioned something one of your interviews, that why such cruelty, right? Why there was such cruelty in our society. So the political reasons we know, right? And the results after 40 some years become more evident, something that we couldn't talk about it even 20 years after revolution. Now, there are more and more people, fortunately, talking about it. But it also shows that now probably it's time to look at our society. So again, I want to go back to the collective fear of talking about this secret. And you mentioned something about why you asked that question. I think asking questions are very crucial. That how come they become successful? How come the government could do that? Such a cruelty, such extreme violence, imposing it on society and opposition, and the society was forced to tolerate it. And you said as one of the reasons that why they could become successful is they could break down the family relationships. So I wonder if you could elaborate on that. I have personal memories of those days, but you were very young, and I really am interested to hear your experience of what and how do you think they could break down these family relationship, and how that helped them to become more successful. Thank you.
I mean, they tried, they did everything they could in order to break those family relationships, and they targeted it. I mean, when you read memoirs, testimonies, you understand how family relationships were really targeted. It was not a casualty of the prison experience. It was one of the most sophisticated moral torture, specifically on women who had children, mothers, but also, between couples. I mean, I don't know. You're certainly, I mean, I'm not, you have firsthand experience. I have childhood memories, but I think that family and generation, these are two notions that are maybe not enough taken into account when we are doing social analysis. And so the German sociologist Charles Mannheim talk about the question of the generations when he wrote that very interesting text in the 1950s, saying how Nazi Germany actually froze, not froze, but solidified and created a collective experience for one generation, and then all those who have lived through that will kind of always like their share this the way the historical event has, you know, crossed or touched their age life, their personal trajectory, has kind of crystallized their generation in their 20s. For instance, my generation, I have been kind of solidified by the event in my childhood. So I am a child of Daesh. My grandfather is a father. He has been other things in his life. My grandmother has been young one day, but one, you know, مادران خاوران, we don't remember them young. And your generation who did the revolution, you will always be 20. Like you have been like kind of like Hamid Nouri. Hamid Nouri is still this young man when you look, like his body language is fixed in this event that has kind of, you know, twisted and shaped his life. So this is for the generations, and the other, I think, kind of lens through which we are not looking enough into social relations is family, of course. So what happens in the family and the role the families are playing within authoritarian states or states that target the individualization, as Anna Arendt said, as a way of governing, is very important. And so we understand, you know, the importance also of breaking family ties. And I tried to reflect on that in a piece, in a paper I wrote on prison and motherhood, and the psychological, you know, the way the mothers were targeted as mothers by moral torture in prison. And there was two aspects. There was a spectacle aspect of re-enhancing or performing social political values, Islamic values that were not traditional. It was the Islamic Republic reading of traditional values. Performing that and restating that for the families as well. That was one dimension. And the other one was, you know, isolating people, breaking up, and trying to desubjectivize. So this was the politics of cruelty. But then, you know, looking at the family level or scale is very important, but it is less often done because it's so full of affects and it's so messy. People do, you know, they like paradoxical choices, many multi-layered choices, multi-layered level of repression. You can be forced by a father or a brother or a mother. You can be forced to become a tavab as much as you can be forced by the authorities, and all these are multi-layered. But when you talk about state repression, you will not talk about your family intimidations, because this is not something that you bring out into the public. But then when you want to understand what happened, then you have to go back to that level. And this is why in social science, anonymity is so important. For instance, for my paper on prison and motherhood, I did more than 40 interviews with women who had been mother in prison. They were mother while, or they gave birth in prison, or they were mother while they were imprisoned. And at the end of the day, I only talk about my own specific case, because I felt that even anonymizing interviews was not enough to kind of respect, you know, all the intimacy that is implied in those family relations and different levels of power relations. So I had to kind of hide them behind the one case, and then I will bring back my learnings, my teaching, saying that, oh, but this I know with, you know, through interviews with others. And build upon, but I could not bring other case studies because it's so sensitive. So obviously, you know, arts and filmmaking and writing can be a way also of going beyond all these issues of anonymity, of decency, of, you know, intimacy that social science has to deal with.
Thank you very much, Chowra. for all your hard work. At the same time, I think it takes a lot of courage to share personal stories, and at the same time, at all your theories and analysis. I feel like I was very lucky to have you, to listen to you, and I wish you best luck. I want to thank all our audience for patiently listening and sharing their ideas. I would like to remind you of our next program on May 15th. Our next speaker is Ilham Homifar, and the topic of her talk is environmental social movement in Iran, a challenge to the dominant narrative. And I welcome Berkeley Lecture Series to invite such speakers like Chowra Makaremi and our next speakers, and such interesting topics that, we still need a lot of work in that areas. So again, thanks everyone for listening, and especially thank you, Chowra, for sharing your thoughts and ideas.
Right.
Good luck to you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.